You're alone in the woods, miles from help. And then you hear it. Footsteps circling your tent at 3 a.m. What happens next will make you never want to go camping again. These are 10 real camping horror stories that will haunt your dreams. My name is Sarah, and I'm 26 years old. Last summer, I went camping with my best friend Emma in the Cascade Mountains. We picked a remote spot about 4 miles from the nearest parking area because we wanted total peace and quiet. No crowds, no noise, just us and nature. That was our first mistake. We got to the campsite around 5 p.m. It was a small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees on all sides. There was an old fire pit in the center with rocks around it and a flat spot perfect for our tent. The trees were so tall and dense that even in daylight, the woods felt dark and closed in. Emma joked that it felt like we were being watched. I laughed it off, but something about the way she said it made my stomach feel weird. We set up our tent and collected firewood before it got dark. By 7 p.m., the sun was starting to set and shadows were getting longer. We made hot dogs over the fire and talked about normal stuff, work, relationships, nothing important. But as it got darker, we both got quieter. The woods around us were completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the crackling of our fire. I remember Emma mentioning how weird it was that we hadn't heard a single animal sound since we arrived. Not even a squirrel rustling through leaves or a crow cawing in the distance. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around 9 p.m., Emma went into the tent to change into her sleeping clothes. I stayed by the fire, poking at it with a stick. That's when I saw it. About 30 feet away between 2 trees, there was a shape. It looked like a person standing completely still, just watching me. My heart jumped into my throat. I stared at it for a few seconds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shape didn't move at all. It was tall, definitely human-sized, with what looked like arms hanging at its sides. The firelight didn't reach that far, so I could only see a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter background of the forest. I squinted, trying to see better, thinking maybe it was just a weird tree trunk or a shadow. But the more I looked, the more certain I became that it was a person. The proportions were too perfect, too human. I called out to Emma in a shaky voice. She crawled out of the tent and asked what was wrong. I pointed to the spot, but when I looked again, nothing was there. Just trees and darkness. Emma said I was probably just seeing shadows and told me to relax. I wanted to believe her, but I knew what I saw. That wasn't a shadow. It had a human shape, with shoulders and a head. It was too defined, too real. And here's what really bothered me. I hadn't heard any footsteps. If someone had walked away, I would have heard the leaves crunching or branches snapping. But there was only silence. It was like the figure had simply dissolved into the darkness. We decided to go to bed early. Emma fell asleep almost immediately, but I couldn't. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the roof of the tent, listening. For about an hour, everything was quiet. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the leaves and twigs around our tent. They walked in a circle around us, all the way around, stopping every few steps like someone was examining us. The pattern was methodical, precise. Step, 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 pause. Step, 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 pause. Like whoever it was wanted us to hear them, wanted us to know they were there. I grabbed Emma's arm and whispered her name. She woke up confused and groggy. I told her to be quiet and listen. We both froze. The footsteps continued. They moved slowly, crunching leaves, snapping small branches. They circled us 3 times. Each time they passed the front of the tent, they would stop for a few seconds, then keep moving. During those pauses, I could swear I heard breathing. Not heavy breathing, just the quiet, steady sound of someone standing still, listening to us the same way we were listening to them. Emma's hand was shaking in mine. She whispered that we should call out and ask who was there. I shook my head. Something inside me screamed not to make a sound, not to let whoever or whatever it was know we were awake. Every instinct I had told me that responding would be a mistake, that acknowledging this presence would somehow give it permission to do something worse. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the tent door. We could hear breathing. Heavy, slow breathing like someone had been walking for hours. Then a shadow appeared on the tent wall. The shape of a head and shoulders backlit by the moonlight. It just stood there, not moving, not speaking, just standing. I could see the outline of what looked like long hair hanging down past the shoulders. The figure seemed to be leaning forward slightly, like it was trying to hear better, trying to catch any sound we might make inside the tent. I don't know how long it stayed there. It felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then the shadow moved away and the footsteps started again, this time heading deeper into the woods. But they didn't fade away like normal footsteps would. They just stopped suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch. 1 second we could hear them clearly, the next second, complete silence. We didn't sleep at all that night. We sat huddled together, listening, waiting for it to come back. Every sound made us jump. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch. At some point around 4 a.m., we heard what sounded like voices whispering in the distance. We couldn't make out words, just the low murmur of multiple people talking. But when we strained to hear better, the voices would stop. Then start again a few minutes later from a different direction. When the sun finally came up around 6 a.m., we didn't waste any time. We packed up our tent as fast as we could, barely speaking, just throwing everything into our bags. As we were rolling up the tent, Emma suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed. On the ground around our campsite, there were footprints in the dirt. Bare footprints, no shoes. They circled the tent multiple times and led off into the trees in every direction, like whoever it was had been walking back and forth all night long. But here's what made it so much worse. The footprints were wrong. They were human-shaped, but the toes were too long, stretched out in an unnatural way. And some of the prints were smeared, like the person had been dragging their feet or walking in a strange, shuffling manner. We practically ran back to the parking lot. We didn't talk much on the way. When we got to the car, Emma started crying. She said she felt like something had been hunting us, studying us, deciding whether or not to do something terrible. I felt it too. That presence in the woods wasn't just a person out for a walk. It was something wrong, something that didn't belong there. As we were loading our bags into the trunk, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were muddy handprints on the back window of Emma's car. Small handprints, like a child's, pressed against the glass from the outside. But we'd parked here yesterday afternoon and the car had been clean. Someone or something had touched our car during the night while we were in the woods, completely unaware. We reported it to the ranger station. They said they'd look into it but didn't seem very concerned. They asked if we'd seen an actual person or just heard sounds. When we told them about the footprints, they said it could have been another camper playing a prank. But I know what we experienced. That wasn't a prank. That was something watching us, circling us, waiting. And I still have nightmares about that shadow on the tent wall and the sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps in the dark. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear that same breathing outside my bedroom window. and I have to check 3 times to make sure the locks are secure. Emma doesn't go camping anymore at all. She won't even go hiking on marked trails during the day. She told me last month that she still feels like something followed us out of those woods. And honestly, some nights when I'm alone, I think she might be right. Story 2. The Tent That Wasn't Ours. I'm Mike, 31 years old, and I used to love solo camping. Notice I said used to. What happened to me last year in the Appalachian wilderness changed everything. I'll never camp alone again. And honestly, I'm not sure I'll ever camp at all. It was late September, and I decided to take a 3-day camping trip to a remote area I'd been to once before. The spot was beautiful, a small clearing next to a stream surrounded by thick forest. The nearest trail was about 2 miles away, so I knew I'd have complete privacy. I packed my gear, drove out Friday afternoon, and hiked in before sunset. The first night was perfect. I set up my tent, a small 2-person green tent, built a fire, cooked dinner, and fell asleep to the sound of the stream. I woke up Saturday morning feeling refreshed and ready for a day of hiking. I left my tent set up and headed out around 8 a.m. with just a day pack. I planned to explore some trails and be back by evening. I hiked for about 6 hours, saw some incredible views, and made it back to camp around 4 p.m. But when I walked into the clearing, my stomach dropped. There were 2 tents, mine and another one. The second tent was about 20 feet from mine, also green but slightly larger. It looked brand new, no dirt, no wear. I stopped dead in my tracks and looked around. I didn't see anyone. No person, no gear outside the tent, no fire, nothing. Just the tent zipped shut. What made it even stranger was the positioning. The tent was set up facing directly toward mine, like whoever put it there wanted to watch my tent. The door flaps were aligned perfectly with mine, creating this unsettling sense that someone inside could be staring at my entrance. I walked closer slowly, feeling uneasy. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No answer. I called out again, louder. Still nothing. The only sound was the stream and wind in the trees. I stood there debating what to do. Maybe someone had set up camp and gone hiking. That seemed reasonable, but something felt wrong. The tent was in a weird spot, facing away from the stream toward the woods. Who would set up a tent like that? And why so close to mine when there was plenty of space elsewhere in the clearing? The more I thought about it, the more my skin crawled. I decided to leave it alone and went to my tent. I unzipped it and climbed inside to grab some water. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Inside my tent, my sleeping bag was unzipped and laid out flat, like someone had been lying in it. I specifically remembered zipping it up that morning before I left. I always zip it up to keep bugs out. My backpack was also moved. It had been against the left wall of the tent, and now it was in the center. But what really terrified me was what I found when I looked closer at my sleeping bag. There were dirt marks on it, like someone with muddy boots had walked across it. And there was an indentation in my pillow, a clear head-shaped depression, like someone had been lying there, resting their head where mine had been the night before. I backed out of the tent quickly, my heart pounding. Someone had been inside my tent while I was gone. They'd laid in my sleeping bag, touched my things, violated my space. I looked over at the other tent again. It was still zipped shut, still silent. I yelled out, asking who was there and demanding they show themselves. Nothing. The forest was completely quiet. Too quiet. I couldn't even hear birds. I noticed something else then. Around the perimeter of the clearing, There were small piles of rocks stacked in deliberate formations. 3 rocks balanced on top of each other, placed at regular intervals like markers or warnings. I hadn't noticed them when I first arrived, which meant someone had placed them there while I was hiking. Someone had been here organizing the space, claiming it. I made a decision right then. I was leaving. I didn't care about losing a day of camping. Something was very wrong. I started packing up my tent as fast as I could, constantly glancing at the other tent. It didn't move. No one came out. After about 10 minutes, I had everything packed. I threw my bag on my back and started walking toward the trail. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip my pack straps. Then I heard it. A zipper, slow and deliberate. I spun around. The other tent was being unzipped from the inside. I watched, frozen, as the zipper went all the way down. The flap opened. But no one came out. The tent just sat there, door hanging open, completely dark inside. I could see nothing in there. No sleeping bag, no gear, nothing. It was empty. Completely empty. Like it had always been empty. But that wasn't possible. Someone had set it up. Someone had unzipped it just now. I heard the zipper clearly. Unless my mind started racing. Unless whatever was inside wasn't human. Unless it didn't need gear or supplies. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and ran. I ran as fast as I could with a heavy pack on my back, crashing through the trees toward the trail. Branches hit my face and arms, but I didn't stop. I ran for at least 20 minutes straight before I finally slowed down, gasping for air. I looked back but couldn't see the clearing anymore. Just trees in every direction. But I could feel it. I could feel something watching me, following me through the forest. I heard branches breaking behind me, keeping pace with my movements. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, the sound stopped too. Every time I started moving again, they resumed. I kept moving at a fast walk until I reached the main trail, then practically jogged the 2 miles back to the parking lot. When I got to my car, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors. I sat there shaking, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what just happened. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see someone emerge from the trailhead. After about 10 minutes, I saw something that made me want to scream. There was a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, partially hidden in shadows. Just standing there, watching my car. I started the engine immediately and drove away, gravel spraying under my tires. Who put up that tent? Why was it empty? And why did someone go through my stuff? The more I thought about it, the more terrifying it became. Someone had been in my tent while I was hiking. They'd touched my things, laid in my sleeping bag, and then they'd set up their own tent and waited. Waited for what? For me to come back? For me to go to sleep? I drove straight home, didn't stop once. When I got home, I unpacked my bag and found something that made me feel sick. Inside my sleeping bag, there was a Polaroid photo. It was a picture of me sleeping in my tent from the night before. Someone had been inside my tent while I was asleep, standing over me taking photos. The angle was from above, looking down at my face. I was completely unconscious, totally vulnerable. My mouth was slightly open, my eyes closed, completely unaware that someone was documenting me in my most defenseless state. I threw the photo away immediately and called the police. They took a report but said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. They suggested I avoid that camping area in the future. I didn't need to be told twice. I haven't been back to that spot. I haven't been camping at all since then. But here's what really haunts me. In the photo, in the background behind me, you could see the inside of my tent, And hanging from the roof of the tent, barely visible, was a small piece of paper with writing on it. I didn't notice it when I looked at the photo at first because I was so focused on my face. But later I remembered it and I still wonder what it said. Was it a message? A threat? I'll never know. And part of me is glad I'll never know. Because whoever was out there in those woods watching me, following me, they wanted me to know they could get to me anytime they wanted. And that's a feeling I can't shake, no matter how far away I am from those trees. I've started having nightmares about it. In the dreams, I'm back in that tent, and I can feel someone standing over me, watching me sleep. I try to open my eyes, but I can't. I'm paralyzed. And I can hear the camera clicking over and over, taking dozens of photos. When I finally wake up, I'm drenched in sweat, and I have to check every room in my apartment to convince myself I'm alone. My girlfriend thinks I need therapy. She's probably right. But how do you explain to a therapist that you're terrified of something you can't even name? Something that might still be out there, in those woods, waiting for the next person to camp in that clearing? Story 3. The campground that never existed. I'm Jessica and I'm 28. 2 years ago, my boyfriend Tyler and I went camping in Washington State. We'd been planning the trip for months and found what looked like a perfect campground online. The website showed pictures of beautiful sites near a lake with picnic tables and fire pits. The reviews were decent, and the price was cheap, only $15 a night. We booked 2 nights and drove out on a Friday. The drive took longer than expected. The roads got smaller and smaller until we were on a narrow dirt road full of potholes. After about an hour of driving through the woods, we finally saw a wooden sign that said Pine Lake Campground with an arrow pointing left. We turned and drove another 10 minutes until we reached a clearing. But something felt off immediately. The sign had looked old, weathered, like it had been there for decades. But the paint on the letters looked fresh, almost like someone had recently repainted it or created it. The campground was empty, completely empty. There were no other cars, no people, nothing. Just a clearing with several spots marked by old picnic tables and rusty fire pits. The lake was there, but it was smaller than the photos showed, and the water looked dark and murky. Tyler said maybe we were just early and other people would show up later. We picked a spot near the lake and set up our tent. As I was hammering in the tent stakes, I noticed something weird. There were no insects. Not a single mosquito, no flies, nothing. For a campground next to a lake, that was impossible. I mentioned it to Tyler, but he shrugged it off, said we were just lucky. As soon as we finished setting up, the sun started to set. It got dark really fast, faster than normal. Tyler started a fire while I made sandwiches. We sat by the fire eating and talking, trying to ignore how creepy the place felt. There were no lights anywhere, no bathroom buildings, no office, nothing. Just us in the woods. The silence was oppressive. Even the fire seemed quieter than it should have been, like the sound was being absorbed by something around us. Around 10 p.m., we heard a car. We both looked at each other, relieved that someone else was finally here. We heard the car door slam and footsteps walking through the campground. But we didn't see anyone. Tyler stood up and called out, asking if anyone was there. The footsteps stopped. Then they started again, this time walking toward us. We still couldn't see anyone. The footsteps were getting closer, crunching on gravel and dirt, definitely coming from somewhere in the campground. But when we looked in that direction, there was only darkness and empty campsites. Tyler grabbed a flashlight and shined it toward the sound. Nothing. Just empty campsites and dark trees. The footsteps stopped again. We waited, listening. Then we heard a woman's voice calling out from the woods. She was saying, "Help me, please help me," over and over. Tyler immediately started walking toward the voice. I grabbed his arm and told him to stop. Something felt wrong. The voice sounded off, like it was being played from a recording. It had this tinny quality, and the rhythm was too perfect, too mechanical. Each "help me" was spaced exactly the same amount of time apart. Tyler shook me off and kept walking toward the woods with his flashlight. I followed him, scared to be alone. He kept calling out, asking where she was. The voice kept saying, "Help me, I'm lost," but it never got closer or farther away. It stayed at the same volume. After about 5 minutes of walking through the trees, Tyler finally stopped. He turned to me and said this didn't make sense. If someone was really lost, they'd be moving, trying to find us. But the voice was stationary. And now that we were closer, we could hear that it was definitely coming from a single point, like a speaker hidden in the trees. Tyler shined his flashlight in the direction of the voice, and we both saw it at the same time. There was a small device attached to a tree trunk, about chest height. It looked like a portable speaker with a motion sensor. Tyler reached for it, but I pulled him back. Something about this felt like a trap. We turned around to head back to camp. That's when we realized we couldn't see our fire anymore. We'd walked farther than we thought. Tyler used the flashlight to try to find our way back, but everything looked the same. Trees in every direction. We walked for what felt like 20 minutes, getting more and more panicked. Finally, we saw the glow of our fire through the trees and practically ran toward it. I felt relief flood through me as we got closer to the clearing. When we got back to our campsite, we both stopped dead. Our tent was open. We'd zipped it shut before we left. Tyler walked over slowly and looked inside. Everything was thrown around. Our sleeping bags were pulled out, our clothes were scattered, and our food bag was ripped open. But here's the worst part. Written in the dirt next to our tent, in big letters, were the words, "You should leave." The letters were carved deep, done with something sharp, maybe a stick or a knife. And beneath those words, there was a crude drawing of two figures lying down, like bodies, with X marks over where the heads would be. Tyler's face went white. He grabbed my hand and we just stared at the message, trying to process what it meant. Who did this? And more importantly, were they watching us right now? We didn't argue. We packed up everything in about 5 minutes, threw it in the car, and drove out of there as fast as we could. The dirt road seemed longer on the way out, and we got lost twice before finally finding the main road. Every time we made a wrong turn and had to backtrack, I expected to see someone standing in the middle of the road blocking our way. When we finally reached the paved highway, we both started breathing easier. When we got back to town, we tried to report it to the local police. They asked what campground we were at. When we told them Pine Lake Campground, the officer looked confused. He said he'd lived in the area for 20 years and there was no campground by that name. We showed him the website on our phone. He looked at it and said the photos were from a different campground about 50 miles away. The website was fake. He asked for the address or GPS coordinates, but when we tried to pull up our location history, there was nothing. It was like that place didn't exist in our phone's memory. We drove back the next day in daylight to see if we could find the spot. We found the dirt road and the wooden sign. But when we drove down to where the campground should have been, there was nothing. Just woods. No clearing, no picnic tables, no fire pits. It was like the whole place had vanished. To this day, I have no idea what we experienced that night or where we actually were. Tyler refuses to talk about it. He gets angry whenever I bring it up, says I'm obsessing over nothing. But I can't let it go. Because I keep thinking about that website, about how detailed it was. Someone made that. Someone lured us out there. And I keep wondering what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. Would we have disappeared too, like the campground itself? A few months after this happened, I tried searching for the website again. I wanted proof, screenshots, something to validate what we experienced. But the website was completely gone. The URL didn't work anymore. I searched for Pine Lake Campground, Washington, and found nothing. It was like it never existed. I even checked the Wayback Machine, but there was no archive of the site. Tyler thinks I imagined the whole thing, that the stress of our relationship made me hallucinate or something. But I know what I saw. I know where we went, and sometimes late at night, I still hear that voice in my head saying, help me, in that mechanical, emotionless tone. And I wonder who else has heard it. Who else has followed that voice into the woods and never come back? Story 4. The Man at the Edge of Camp. My name is Chris. I'm 34, and I went camping last spring with my 2 buddies, Jake and Marcus. We picked a spot in the Rockies that Jake had been to before. It was a decent hike in, about 3 miles, and the campsite was right next to a river with a great view of the mountains. We got there around noon on Saturday and spent the day fishing and setting up camp. Everything was normal. We saw a few other hikers pass by on the trail, but by evening it was just us. We made dinner over the fire and stayed up late drinking beer and telling stupid stories. Around midnight, we finally called it and went to bed. Jake and Marcus shared a tent, and I had my own smaller one about 10 feet away. I fell asleep pretty quickly, but woke up around 2 a.m. needing to pee. I unzipped my tent and climbed out. It was cold and the sky was clear, full of stars. I walked about 20 feet away from camp to a spot behind some bushes. As I was standing there, I heard something. A rustling sound coming from the other side of camp, past Jake and Marcus's tent. But what made my skin crawl was that it stopped the exact moment I finished. Like whatever was making the noise had been waiting for me to be vulnerable, distracted. I zipped up and walked back toward camp, trying to see what made the noise. That's when I saw him. There was a man standing at the very edge of our campsite, maybe 40 feet away. He was just standing there, perfectly still, facing our tents. He was wearing dark clothes and had a hood pulled up over his head. I couldn't see his face, but I could see his hands hanging at his sides, and they looked wrong somehow. Too long, or held in an unnatural position. I froze. My first thought was maybe it was another camper who got lost or needed help. But something about the way he was standing, completely motionless, made me uneasy. I called out and asked if he was okay. He didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there staring. The silence that followed my question felt heavy, oppressive. Even the river seemed quieter. I raised my voice and said, "Hey, do you need something?" Still nothing. My heart started beating faster. I could feel adrenaline flooding my system. I walked over to Jake's tent and unzipped it. I whispered their names and told them to wake up. Jake groaned and asked what was wrong. I told him there was someone standing at the edge of camp and he wasn't responding. Jake and Marcus both climbed out of the tent. By the time they stood up, the man was gone. We all looked around but didn't see him anywhere. Jake asked if I was sure I saw someone. I told him yes, absolutely sure. I described exactly where he'd been standing, the dark clothes, the hood. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and shined it around the area where the man had been standing. We didn't see anything at first, but then Marcus bent down and picked something up from the ground. It was a small cloth doll, crudely made with button eyes and yarn hair. It was wearing clothes that looked like mine, the same blue jacket I'd been wearing earlier that day. Marcus dropped it like it burned him. We stood there for a few minutes, listening and watching. Jake finally said it was probably just someone passing through and suggested we go back to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We all went back to our tents, but I didn't sleep. I lay there with my eyes open, listening. My hand gripped my knife so hard my palm started to ache. About an hour later, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and quiet, walking around the outside of camp. I sat up and peeked out through the mesh window of my tent. I could see a shadow moving between the trees, circling us. It was the same figure, I was sure of it. The same height, the same hunched posture. But now there seemed to be more than one. I counted at least 3 separate shadows moving in different directions around our camp, like they were coordinating, surrounding us. I wanted to yell for Jake and Marcus, but something told me to stay quiet. The shadow stopped near the river, about 30 feet away. I could see the outline of a person standing there looking toward our tents. After a minute, the shadow moved again, this time walking directly toward my tent. I held my breath. It got closer and closer until it was right outside. I could hear breathing, raspy and uneven, like someone with damaged lungs. Then a hand touched the outside of my tent. It pressed against the fabric near where my head was, like it was feeling for me. The pressure was firm, deliberate. I could see the outline of fingers through the thin material, spreading out, searching. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The hand stayed there for what felt like forever, then slowly pulled away. But as it did, I heard a whisper. My name. Chris. Spoken in a voice I didn't recognize, low and raspy. We know you're awake, Chris. The shadow moved toward Jake's tent next. I heard Jake suddenly shout, "Who the hell is out there?" The shadow took off running into the woods. But it wasn't alone. I heard multiple sets of footsteps crashing through the underbrush, all running in different directions. Jake unzipped his tent and came out with a knife in his hand. Marcus was right behind him with a flashlight. They scanned the area but saw nothing. I climbed out and told them what happened, about the multiple shadows, about the hand on my tent, about someone whispering my name. Marcus's face went pale. He said he'd heard something too, someone trying to unzip his side of the tent from the outside. We decided right then that we were leaving. We packed up camp in the dark as fast as we could and hiked out by flashlight. It took us almost 2 hours to get back to the trailhead, but we didn't stop once. Every sound behind us made us walk faster. At one point, Marcus swore he saw lights moving parallel to us through the trees, keeping pace with our movements. We didn't investigate. We just kept moving. When we got to the parking lot, we sat in the car with the doors locked, too shaken to drive right away. Marcus noticed something on his backpack. There was a piece of paper tucked into one of the straps. He pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map of our campsite with 3 X marks where our tents had been. Underneath it said, "I know where you sleep." None of us spoke. We drove home in complete silence and never went back. But here's what haunts me most. 2 weeks later, Jake got a package in the mail. No return address, just his name and address written in that same shaky handwriting from the note. Inside was a photo of the 3 of us sleeping in our tents that night. The photo was taken from above, like someone had climbed a tree and looked down at us. We were all visible through the tent mesh, completely vulnerable. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Next time." Jake called the police, but they said without more evidence, there wasn't much they could do. We've all moved since then. changed our phone numbers. But sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear someone breathing outside my window, and I have to check the locks 3 times before I can go back to sleep. Story 5. The Sounds from the Cave. I'm Amanda, 25, and last summer I went camping with my cousin Rachel in the Ozarks. We found a spot near a small cave that Rachel wanted to explore. The cave wasn't very big, just a shallow opening in the rocks that went back about 30 feet. We set up our tents in a clearing about 50 feet from the cave entrance. The first day was great. We explored the cave in the afternoon. It was cool and damp inside with some interesting rock formations. We didn't go all the way to the back because it got too dark and narrow. We took some photos near the entrance and then went back to camp. But looking back at those photos later, I noticed something I didn't see at the time. In the background of one picture, deep in the darkness of the cave, there were 2 small points of light, like eyes reflecting our camera flash. But we were alone in that cave, or at least we thought we were. That night, around 11 p.m., we were sitting by the fire when we heard something. It was coming from the cave, a low moaning sound like someone in pain. We both stopped talking and listened. The sound continued for about a minute, then stopped. Rachel said maybe it was wind blowing through the cave. I agreed, trying to convince myself that made sense. But there wasn't any wind that night. The air was completely still. An hour later, we heard it again. This time it was louder and sounded more like words. We couldn't make out what was being said, but it definitely sounded like a human voice. Multiple voices, actually, overlapping, creating this horrible chorus of moaning. Rachel grabbed a flashlight and said we should check it out. I told her absolutely not. There was no way I was going into that cave at night. She called me paranoid but agreed to wait until morning. We went to bed around midnight. I was almost asleep when I heard Rachel whisper my name. I asked what was wrong. She said she could hear something outside her tent. I listened. There was a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. It was moving around Rachel's tent in a circle, getting closer with each pass. I unzipped my tent and looked out. In the moonlight, I could see a figure bent over near Rachel's tent. It looked like a person on all fours crawling, but the movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by strings. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, hanging to one side. I screamed Rachel's name and told her to get out. She burst out of her tent and ran toward me. The figure stood up and ran toward the cave. But it didn't run like a normal person. It moved in this skittering, sideways motion, too fast, its limbs bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. We watched it disappear inside, and for a moment, we saw more of them. Dozens of pale figures crawling on the cave walls, moving like insects, retreating into the darkness. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We sat in my tent with a knife and a can of bear spray, waiting for sunrise. As soon as it was light enough, we packed up and left. We didn't even look at the cave. We just wanted to get out of there. On the hike back to the car, Rachel said she felt like something had been watching us the whole time. I felt it too. Whatever was in that cave, it wasn't wind. And it wasn't alone. When we got home and looked at the photos from inside the cave, we found more than just those glowing eyes. In another photo, if you zoomed in on the darkness, you could see pale handprints all over the cave walls. Hundreds of them, small and large, covering every surface. And in the very back, barely visible, was what looked like a pile of bones. We deleted every photo immediately. Rachel reported it to the Park Service, but when rangers went to investigate, they said they found nothing unusual. No bones, no handprints, nothing. They said we must have been mistaken, but we know what we saw. We know what chased us. And sometimes, late at night, Rachel calls me crying, saying she can still hear that moaning sound in her dreams. And she swears that sometimes when she's alone in her apartment, she hears that same scraping sound circling her bedroom door. Story 6. The Neighboring Campers Who Vanished. I'm David, 30, and this happened 3 years ago. My wife Laura and I went camping at a popular campground in Oregon. The campground was busy, lots of families and groups. We set up our tent in a spot next to a young couple, probably in their early 20s. They introduced themselves as Ben and Sophie. They seemed nice, friendly. We chatted for a bit and then did our own thing. That night, we had a fire and were roasting marshmallows when Ben and Sophie came over and asked if they could join us. We said sure. We talked for a couple hours about random stuff. They said they were from Seattle and had been camping all week. Around 10 p.m., they went back to their tent and we went to bed. They seemed like a normal young couple, happy, in love. But there was something Ben said that stuck with me. Right before they left, he looked at me and said, "Do you ever feel like the woods are full of people you can't see? Like they're always watching, just out of sight?" I laughed it off as a joke, but Sophie didn't laugh. She just looked at the ground. The next morning, I woke up around 7 a.m. and went outside to make coffee. I noticed Ben and Sophie's tent was still zipped shut. I figured they were sleeping in. But by noon, their tent still hadn't opened. Laura said maybe they left really early in the morning. But their car was still parked next to their site. And their cooler was still outside, along with their camping chairs. Nobody packs up and leaves their expensive gear behind. Around 2 p.m., I walked over to their tent and called out. No answer. I knocked on one of the tent poles. Nothing. I unzipped their tent door and looked inside. It was empty. Sleeping bags, backpacks, everything was still there. But Ben and Sophie were gone. Laura and I looked around the campground but didn't see them anywhere. What made it stranger was that their sleeping bags were arranged in a weird way. They were zipped together like they'd been sleeping, but they were positioned in the shape of an X, not side by side like you'd expect. And there were muddy footprints leading from inside the tent, out the door, and into the woods. But only one set of prints, like someone had carried them both out. We reported it to the camp host. He said he'd check into it. By evening, park rangers were at the site asking us questions. We told them everything we knew. They searched the area but found nothing. The next day, we saw their car being towed away. We never heard what happened to them, but here's what bothers me. The night we talked to them by the fire, Ben said something strange. He said, "Do you ever feel like you're being followed, even when you know you're alone?" At the time, I thought it was just a random comment. But looking back, I wonder if they knew something was wrong. I wonder if whatever happened to them could have happened to us. 3 months later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photo of Laura and me sleeping in our tent from that camping trip. We were visible through the mesh, completely unaware we were being photographed. On the back, someone had written, "You were lucky," in handwriting I didn't recognize. I showed it to the police, but they said they couldn't do anything without more information. Laura and I broke up 2 weeks after that. She said she couldn't be with someone who reminded her of that trip. Last I heard, she moved across the country and refuses to go camping ever again. And sometimes I wonder if Ben and Sophie are still out there somewhere, or if they're buried in those woods, and if whoever took them is still watching, waiting for their next victims. Story 7. The Handprints on the Window. My name is Nicole, 27. Last year, my boyfriend Eric and I went camping in his truck. He has a truck with a camper shell on the back, so we set up an air mattress in the bed and slept there instead of using a tent. We drove to a remote spot in New Mexico and parked in a clearing off a dirt road. Everything was fine until around 1 a.m. I woke up to a tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone knocking on glass. I opened my eyes and listened. It stopped. I figured I imagined it and started to fall back asleep. Then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. This time Eric woke up too. He whispered, "Did you hear that?" I said yes. The tapping had a rhythm to it, deliberate, like someone was trying to get our attention without startling us too much. The tapping came again, this time from the window right next to my head. I looked at the window, but it was too dark outside to see anything. Eric grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. He shined it at the window and we both gasped. There was a handprint on the glass. A dirty handprint like someone had pressed their muddy hand against the window from outside. But it wasn't just mud. The print looked like it had been made with something dark and wet, almost like blood mixed with dirt. And the fingers were too long, stretched out in an unnatural way. Eric yelled, "Who's there?" and banged on the wall of the truck. We heard footsteps running away, but they sounded wrong. Too many footsteps, like multiple people had been standing around the truck. Eric unlocked the camper shell and jumped out with his flashlight. I begged him not to go, but he didn't listen. I sat in the truck bed shaking, waiting for him to come back. The seconds felt like hours. I could hear him walking around the truck, his footsteps crunching on gravel. Then I heard him say, "Oh my God," in a voice I'd never heard from him before. Pure terror. After a few minutes, he climbed back in. His face was pale, eyes wide. He said he didn't see anyone, but he found more handprints on the other windows and on the hood of the truck. Dozens of them, all over the truck, like multiple people had been touching it, examining it, surrounding us while we slept. Some of the prints were small, like children's hands. Others were large, adult-sized. But all of them had those same elongated fingers. He also found something else. There were markings scratched into the paint on the driver's side door. Symbols he didn't recognize carved deep into the metal. We didn't stay. Eric started the truck and we drove out of there immediately. But as we were pulling away, I looked back and saw them. There were figures standing at the edge of the clearing. At least 7 or 8 of them just watching us leave. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there in a line like they were seeing us off. We drove for an hour before we felt safe enough to stop at a gas station. We cleaned the handprints off the truck with paper towels. They were muddy and smelled weird, like rot and something chemical, almost medicinal. The smell wouldn't come off our hands even after washing them 3 times. We never went back to that spot. And we never camped in the truck again. But here's what really messed us up. A week later, Eric went to get his truck detailed to remove those scratch symbols. The detailer called him and said he needed to come look at something. When Eric got there, the guy showed him the marks under UV light. They glowed. The symbols glowed bright green under UV light, like they'd been made with some kind of phosphorescent material. And beneath them, barely visible, were words scratched in tiny letters. "We know your plate number." Eric sold the truck the next month. He said he didn't feel safe driving it anymore. And sometimes, late at night, we both wake up to the sound of tapping on our bedroom window. But when we look, there's never anyone there. Just handprints on the glass that weren't there when we went to bed. Story 8. The Trail That Led Nowhere. I'm Brian, 29, and I went hiking alone last fall in Montana. I parked at a trailhead and started hiking around 9 a.m. The trail was well marked and I'd hiked it before. After about 2 hours, I reached a spot where I planned to camp for the night. I set up my tent and spent the afternoon relaxing. Around 5 p.m., I decided to explore a side trail I'd noticed on the way in. It wasn't on my map, but it looked worn down, like people used it. I figured it probably led to a viewpoint or something. I started walking down the trail with just my phone and a water bottle. The trees on either side were dense, blocking out most of the sunlight even though it was still afternoon. After about 20 minutes, I realized the trail was getting narrower and harder to follow. I checked my phone, but I had no signal. I decided to turn back. But when I turned around, I couldn't find the trail. The path I'd just walked down was gone. I looked around, trying to figure out which direction I came from, but everything looked the same. Just trees and rocks. A growing sense of panic started to build in my chest. I started walking in what I thought was the right direction. After 10 minutes, I saw something weird. There was a tent set up in the middle of nowhere. It was old and tattered, barely standing. The fabric was torn and faded, like it had been there for years. I called out, but no one answered. I walked up to it and looked inside. There was a sleeping bag, a backpack, and some old food wrappers. Everything was covered in dust and dirt, like it had been abandoned for years. But here's what made my skin crawl. The sleeping bag was laid out like someone had just been using it. And next to it was a journal, open to a page with today's date written at the top. Beneath the date was a single sentence. "He's here again." I backed away from the tent and kept walking, trying to find my way back. But I kept ending up at the same tent. No matter which direction I walked, I always circled back to it. I started panicking. I yelled for help, but my voice just echoed back to me, distorted, like it was being played through a speaker. As it got darker, I realized I was lost. I decided to stay near the tent for the night because at least it was a landmark. But something told me not to go inside it, not to touch anything. I sat down next to the tent and tried to stay calm. Around 9 p.m., I heard footsteps. Someone was walking toward me through the dark. I stood up and called out. A man appeared from the trees. He was wearing old hiking clothes and had a long beard. His clothes looked like they were from decades ago, outdated styles I'd only seen in old photos. He looked at me and said, "You shouldn't have come here." His voice was hollow, echoing. Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked away. I tried to follow him, but he disappeared into the darkness. I called after him, but got no response. I spent the whole night sitting by that tent, terrified and confused. Every hour or so, I'd hear footsteps circling me, always staying just out of sight in the darkness. Sometimes I'd hear voices whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. As soon as the sun came up, I picked a direction and walked for hours. I marked trees as I went, trying to make sure I wasn't going in circles. Finally, around noon, I found a real trail and followed it back to the trailhead. When I got to my car, I checked my phone. It was Sunday morning. I'd been lost for almost 24 hours. But here's the thing. When I checked my photos, there was a picture I didn't take. It was a photo of me sleeping next to that tent. Someone had taken it during the night while I was unconscious. But that wasn't all. There were dozens of photos I didn't take. Photos of me walking in circles. Photos of me sitting by the tent. Photos of me looking confused and scared. All taken from different angles, like multiple people had been documenting my entire experience. I reported it to the park rangers. They searched the area but said they couldn't find any tent or abandoned campsite matching my description. They suggested I'd gotten disoriented and maybe hallucinated from dehydration. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. And I know those photos are real. I had them printed and stored them in a safe deposit box because I'm terrified they'll disappear from my phone. Sometimes I look at them, trying to understand. In one photo, you can see shadows in the background, multiple human-shaped shadows all watching me. And in the last photo, the one taken right before I woke up, you can see something written in the dirt next to me. Come back soon. Story 9. The Lights in the Forest. I'm Melissa, 26, and 2 years ago I went camping with a group of friends in Pennsylvania. There were 6 of us total. We found a spot deep in the forest and set up 3 tents. The first night was fun. We had a fire, played music, and stayed up late. Around 2 a.m., my friend Ashley woke everyone up. She said she saw lights in the forest. We all looked, and sure enough, there were small lights moving between the trees about 100 feet away. They looked like flashlights, but they were moving in a strange pattern, going up and down and side to side. They didn't move like someone walking. They floated, drifted, pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. My friend Tom said it was probably other campers. But the lights didn't look right. They were too bright and they moved too smoothly, like they were floating. We watched them for about 10 minutes. Then they started moving toward us. Everyone got nervous. Tom grabbed a flashlight and yelled, "Hello? Who's there?" The lights stopped. Then they split up, going in different directions around our camp surrounding us. There had to be at least 20 of them now, maybe more, forming a complete circle around our campsite. We all huddled together near the fire. The lights were getting closer. We could see them clearly now, about 30 feet away, behind trees. But we couldn't see who or what was holding them. Tom said we should leave. We agreed and started packing up as fast as we could. But the lights started moving faster, darting back and forth. One of them came right up to the edge of our camp and stopped. We could see it clearly. It wasn't a flashlight. It was just a ball of light, floating in the air with nothing holding it. About the size of a softball, glowing with this cold blue-white light that hurt to look at directly. We ran. We left our tents and most of our gear and just ran back to the trail. The lights followed us for about a mile before they finally disappeared. But as they faded away, we heard something that made our blood run cold. Laughter. Children's laughter, echoing through the forest, coming from every direction at once. When we got to our cars, we sat there trying to catch our breath. None of us could explain what we saw. The next day, some of us went back to get our stuff. Our tents were still there, but everything inside had been thrown around. And in the dirt near the fire pit, there were symbols drawn. Circles and lines that didn't make any sense. Complex geometric patterns that looked almost mathematical. My friend Dave took a photo of them. When he got home and showed it to his college professor who studied ancient symbols, the professor went pale. He said the symbols matched nothing in any known language or culture, but they reminded him of things he'd seen in classified military documents about UFO encounters. We grabbed our things and left. I've never been camping in that area again. But here's what haunts me. 3 weeks later, Ashley started having nightmares. She said she dreamed about the lights every night, and in her dreams she could see faces inside them. Human faces, but wrong somehow. Stretched and distorted. She went to a sleep specialist who couldn't find anything wrong with her. The nightmares continued for months. Then one night she woke up and found a burn mark on her arm. A perfect circle, about 2 inches across, like she'd been branded. She has no memory of how it got there. She showed it to doctors, but they said it looked like a deliberate burn, not an accident. The pattern of the burn matched one of the symbols we'd seen drawn in the dirt at our campsite. Ashley moved to another state and changed her phone number. Last I heard, she still has the nightmares. And sometimes on clear nights, she says she can see the lights outside her window, watching her, waiting. Story 10. The Voice That Knew My Name. My name is Kevin, 32, and this happened last summer in Colorado. I went on a solo camping trip to clear my head after a bad breakup. I hiked about 5 miles into the wilderness and set up camp near a stream. The spot was beautiful and completely isolated. I didn't see anyone else the whole day. That night, I was lying in my tent reading when I heard someone say my name. Kevin? It was a woman's voice, soft and clear, like she was standing right outside my tent. I froze. I called out and asked who was there. No answer. I unzipped my tent and looked outside. Nothing, just darkness and the sound of the stream. I convinced myself I imagined it and went back inside. 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Kevin, come here. The voice was farther away this time, like it was coming from the woods. I got scared. How did this person know my name? I shouted that I was armed and they should leave me alone. The voice laughed. Not a mean laugh, just a soft giggle. But it didn't sound quite human. The tone was off, the rhythm wrong. I grabbed my knife and flashlight and stayed in my tent, too scared to go outside. The voice kept calling my name throughout the night. Sometimes it sounded close, sometimes far away. It never said anything else, just my name over and over. Kevin, Kevin, Kevin! Sometimes it was the woman's voice. Sometimes it sounded like my ex-girlfriend. Sometimes it sounded like my mother. Each time the voice was different, but always calling my name with the same sing-song cadence. Around 4 a.m., I finally fell asleep from exhaustion. When I woke up at sunrise, I immediately packed up and started hiking back. On the way out, I found something that made my skin crawl. There was a small pile of rocks stacked near the trail. On top of the rocks was a piece of paper with my name written on it. The handwriting was shaky, like a child wrote it. But beneath my name were other names, dozens of them, written in different handwriting styles, like different people had added to the list over time. I recognized one of the names. It was my cousin who had died in these mountains 3 years ago while hiking alone. His body was never found. I didn't touch it. I just kept walking until I got to my car. I never found out who was in those woods or how they knew my name. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there. And whatever was watching me wanted me to know it. Here's what makes it worse. When I got home and checked my phone, I had dozens of missed calls. All from my own number. I listened to the voicemails. Each one was just breathing and that woman's voice whispering my name. Kevin, Kevin, Kevin. I changed my number immediately. But a week later, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photo of me sleeping in my tent from that night. In the photo, you could see a figure standing in the trees behind my tent, barely visible in the darkness. And written on the back of the photo in that same childlike handwriting, I know where you live now. I moved 2 months later. Didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my family. I got a P.O. box instead of using my home address for mail. I installed security cameras around my new apartment. But sometimes late at night, I still hear it. That voice, calling my name from outside my window. Kevin. I've looked outside dozens of times, but there's never anyone there. My therapist says it's PTSD. that my brain is replaying the trauma, but I know what I hear. And I know that whatever was in those woods followed me home. Last week, I found another pile of rocks on my doorstep. On top was a piece of paper with my new address written on it. And beneath it, in that same shaky handwriting, were the words, "Found you." Finally, these 10 stories remind us that the wilderness isn't always as peaceful as it seems. Something is out there in the dark, watching and waiting. The next time you go camping, remember these stories. Check your surroundings, lock your tent, and whatever you do, don't follow the voices in the woods. Because sometimes the scariest part of camping isn't being alone. It's realizing you never were. Stay safe out there, and remember, not all who wander in the wilderness are lost. Some are hunting. If you enjoyed these terrifying true stories, let me know in the comments which one scared you the most. And if you have your own camping horror story, share it below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.